The forest is silent. Not the comfortable silence of an empty room, but the dense, loaded silence of a place that is waiting. Frost clings to the bracken. A thin mist rises from the river below, and somewhere beneath a tangle of ancient hazel and oak, something moves. A flicker of movement, low to the ground, deliberate. And then, stillness again. It takes you a moment to understand what you are seeing. Not a domestic cat gone feral, not a shadow, but something older. Something that once threaded through these same valleys when wolves still howled from the ridgelines and beavers dammed every river in Britain. Something that was declared extinct in England over 400 years ago. The Scottish wildcat, Felis sylvestris grampia, one of the rarest wild felids on Earth, and as of autumn 2023 hunting through the trees of Allerdale Wilderness Reserve in the Scottish Highlands, and more recently through carefully selected rewilded woodlands further south, for the first time in living memory. 35 of them released. And what came next changed not just the landscape, but how scientists and ecologists think about the invisible architecture of an ecosystem. Let us go slowly here, because this story deserves to be told properly. England was not always this way. The orderly patchwork of fields you see from an aeroplane window, those hedgerows and managed farmlands, those precise geometric shapes of cultivation, this is recent. Geologically speaking, almost instantaneous. 10,000 years ago, as the last ice retreated north, a great forest swept back across these islands. Ecologists call it the Wildwood. It was not a park. It was not managed. It was vast and dark and layered and alive in ways we can barely imagine now. It ran from the southern coasts to the northern moorlands, and it was full, genuinely, staggeringly full of life. Lynx moved through the understory. Brown bears climbed the older oaks. Wild boar rooted through the forest floor, their disturbance creating pockets of bare earth where light could reach and new plants could establish. Elk, now called moose, waded through the marsh edges, and threading between them all, as silent as falling snow, was the wildcat. It is easy to look at a wildcat and mistake it for something familiar. It wears the same basic form as the tabby on your windowsill, same rough geometry, same amber eyes. But there the comparison dissolves. The wildcat is broader through the shoulders, more heavily muscled in the haunches, and it carries about it a quality that domestic cats, softened over 10,000 years of human proximity, have entirely lost. A quality of pure, undiluted self-sufficiency. It does not need you. It does not want you near. It has never needed anything from our species except to be left alone, and we could not manage even that. The wildcat vanished from England somewhere around the late 16th century. The precise date is impossible to pin down. Extinctions rarely announce themselves, but the causes are well understood. Deforestation was the first blow. The wildwood was cleared steadily over millennia, converted to farmland and sheep pasture, and as the habitat shrank, wildcat populations fragmented, isolated, began to lose resilience. Then came persecution. For centuries, wildcats were trapped and shot by gamekeepers who viewed them as threats to pheasant and grouse. They were not wrong. A wildcat is an extraordinarily effective predator, capable of taking prey several times its own body weight. But effective predation is not a moral failing. It is an ecological role. And when that role was removed by human hand, the consequences quietly began to accumulate. Then came something subtler and perhaps more insidious than trapping. As the wildcat retreated into the remaining fragments of suitable habitat in Scotland, it encountered an unexpected threat from an unexpected source. The domestic cat, Felis catus, Britain's most beloved pet, which had been escaping human homes and farmyards for centuries and establishing feral populations in the countryside. Wildcats and domestic cats can interbreed. The resulting offspring are fertile. And over generations, this hybridization, this slow genetic dilution, blurred the boundary between species until, in many parts of Scotland, it became genuinely difficult to identify a pure wildcat at all. By the early 21st century, genetic surveys suggested fewer than 300 individuals might carry wildcat ancestry to any meaningful degree. The number of truly pure wildcats was estimated at perhaps a few dozen, perhaps fewer. This is a species on the edge of a genetic abyss, And it was into this context that a coalition of conservation organisations, including the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland, Saving Wildcats, and a network of rewilding estates, conceived a programme that many considered audacious to the point of recklessness. They would breed wildcats in captivity from the purest genetic stock available, verified through careful DNA analysis. They would raise them with minimal human contact, and then they would release them into the land, first into the Scottish Highlands, and then, in a step that would have seemed inconceivable just a decade earlier, into carefully selected rewilded habitats further into England. 35 individuals, released across several sites, the first return of this animal to southern Britain since Shakespeare was alive. What happened next requires patience to understand, because nature is not a drama with a simple arc. It is a web, and when you reintroduce a thread that has been missing for 4 centuries, the reverberations move through that web in ways that take time to reveal themselves. The immediate signs were cautious. Trail cameras placed across the release sites showed the cats moving, dispersing, establishing territories, investigating their new landscapes. Some individuals covered extraordinary distances in their first weeks, moving many miles through woodland corridors, testing the edges of their range. This dispersal behavior is normal for a species that in the wild maintains large, overlapping territories, with males ranging over areas that can exceed 30 square kilometers. But would they survive? Would they hunt effectively? Would the hybrid threat, domestic cats gone wild, living in these same margins, undermine everything? The ecologists watched, and what the data began to reveal, slowly, over months and then years, was not a simple success story. It was something more complex and more meaningful than that. The wildcats hunted. Rabbit populations in certain zones began to show measurable changes in their spatial behavior, not dramatic crashes. The wildcat is not a wolf, does not hunt in packs, does not restructure prey populations through sheer numbers. But rabbits and small mammals in territories occupied by wildcats began to move differently, to graze more cautiously, to spend less time in open ground. And this behavioral shift, this ecology of fear, as scientists sometimes call it, had cascading effects that played out across the landscape. Where rabbits grazed less intensively, vegetation changed. Grasses grew taller in certain patches. Wildflowers established in margins that had been kept cropped close to the soil. Invertebrate populations responded, and where invertebrate populations changed, bird communities began to shift. The connections ran in every direction simultaneously, like light through a prism. This is the nature of a keystone interaction, not a keystone species in the dramatic wolves reshaping rivers sense that Yellowstone made famous. The wildcat's influence is subtler, more distributed, but the principle is the same. Every species in an ecosystem is a node in a network. Remove enough nodes, and the network loses coherence. Restore them, and coherence slowly reasserts itself. There is something almost philosophical in this. We tend to think of ecosystems as collections of organisms, as inventories, but they are more accurately understood as relationships. The organisms are almost secondary. What matters, what does the actual work of ecological function, is the interaction between them, the predator and the prey, the herbivore and the plant, the soil organism and the root. Remove the wildcat and you do not simply lose a cat-shaped hole in the species list. You lose a relationship. You lose the fear it generates in the rabbit. You lose the vegetation structure that fear maintained. You lose the invertebrates that lived in that vegetation. You lose the birds that fed on those invertebrates. You lose the whole downstream consequence of one presence. And when you restore that presence, those consequences, slowly, imperfectly, over years and decades, begin to return. Not all of it went smoothly. Some released individuals did not survive their first winter. Mortality among reintroduced animals is expected and is built into the program's models, but each loss carried weight. One female, fitted with a GPS collar, moved through lowland farmland in a way that suggested she was struggling to find sufficient prey in an overmanaged landscape. She was not seen again after February. There were conflicts with local communities. Not everywhere and not overwhelming, but real. Gamekeepers on some estates remain deeply skeptical, understandably, given centuries of institutional conflict between wildcat presence and managed game shooting. Some residents near release sites express concern about the safety of domestic cats and small livestock, though the evidence for significant predation on pets or chickens proved minimal. These tensions matter. They are not obstacles to dismiss. Rewilding without community does not work. It breeds resentment. It politicizes conservation in ways that make the next project harder. The organizations running the Wildcat program understood this and invested significant time in local engagement, in listening, in building what genuine trust they could. But then came the turning point that nobody had quite predicted, and it came not from the ecology but from the genetics. By the second year after the initial releases, DNA samples collected from scat and hare snares across the release zones began to reveal something remarkable. The released wildcats, captive bred, yes, but drawn from genetically verified, relatively pure stock, were not hybridizing with local feral domestic cats at the rate that had been feared. The rate of hybridization in the wild Scottish population had been linked partly to habitat quality and prey density. Where habitat was good, wildcats maintained larger territories, were less likely to encounter domestic cats, and were more selective in mate choice. In the rewilded zones where active habitat management had increased prey availability and structural complexity, the wildcats appeared to be finding each other. The monitoring data showed evidence of natural pair formation between released individuals. And in the spring of the second year, camera traps at 2 separate sites captured something that made the ecologists stop and stare at their screens in silence. Kittens. 2 litters. 4 kittens in total, born wild, in English woodland, for the first time in 4 centuries. They are small and fierce and absolutely themselves, captured in grainy infrared footage moving through the leaf litter behind their mother. They do not know what they represent. They do not carry the weight of their species' history on their small shoulders. They are simply hunting, simply alive, simply occupying the niche that evolution spent millions of years constructing for them in this landscape. But we know what they represent, and that knowledge, if you let yourself feel it fully, is almost overwhelming. What does it mean to restore something? Not to preserve it in captivity, pinned behind glass, a genetic archive of something that once was, but to genuinely restore it, to return it to the land and watch the land receive it, to see the relationships begin to reassemble themselves, to understand that the ecosystem was not simply diminished by the wildcat's absence, that it was quietly, persistently waiting. Ecosystems have memory, not in any mystical sense, but in a very concrete ecological one. The structures of habitat, the configurations of cover and open ground, the distribution of prey species, the architecture of the food web retain the shape of the interactions that once operated within them. There are ghost niches in every impoverished landscape, ecological spaces that were carved by species no longer present, maintained by the systems that evolved alongside them, waiting for the missing piece to return. The wildcat niche in English woodland was never truly empty. It was latent, waiting with the patience that only systems without consciousness can sustain. Decades, centuries, waiting. And 35 small, fierce, amber-eyed animals stepped back into it. And the forest, slowly, incompletely, imperfectly, genuinely, began to remember what it was. There is a moment, if you are very still and very lucky, on an early morning when the light is just beginning to break through the canopy and the mist is still in the hollows, a moment when you hear nothing, when the birds have not yet started, when the world seems to hold its breath between dark and dawn. In that moment, if you know what you are looking for, you might see it, low through the understory, moving with the perfect silence of a creature that has not been away, not really, but has simply been elsewhere, patient, enduring, trusting, if that is the right word for something without trust, that the land would eventually call it home. It is home now. And if we can learn anything from this, from the kittens born in English woodland, from the rabbits moving differently, from the wildflowers finding the light in the patches where the grazing has lifted, it is this: the natural world does not need us to manage it into health. It needs us, finally, after a very long time, to step back and let it remember what health looks like. The frost will thaw, the mist will lift, the forest will fill slowly with the sounds of a morning that is more complete than the one before it. And somewhere in the bracken, something old is moving through the light.